if I believe Mark Carney, and if you all want to believe Mark Carney, then Mark Carney's response to the most significant crisis in our lifetimes is to actually go on vacation. Is that the leader you want?
Trump's tariffs may have just been declared illegal, but don't expect relief at the border anytime soon. Even if the ruling holds, Canada is still facing plant closures, job losses, and small businesses on the brink after a decade of Liberal policy failures. And come the fall, Mark Carney has a lot to answer for.
Let's take a look.
Tonight, a major legal blow to U.S. President Donald Trump's trade agenda. A federal appeals court has ruled his sweeping tariffs were unconstitutional, stating he had no legal authority to impose them under a national emergency. The news coming as Canada's trade war with the U.S. is beginning to take an unmistakable toll on our economy. New numbers show GDP declined in the second quarter 0.4%. That's 1.6% on an annualized basis, the first quarterly contraction since 2023. We'll get more on that and the possible ramifications for the Canadian economy in just a moment. But we begin with the breaking court ruling that sets up a high-stakes showdown that could end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. Mackenzie Gray is following the developments for us. Mac, the world is watching as things unfold in the U.S. tonight.
They certainly are, Eric. This is a major decision here that encompasses most of the tariffs that Donald Trump has put forward. It was a split 7-4 decision at the U.S. Appeals Court. And we spoke with one of the groups that brought forward the challenge. And they say, Eric, that the fentanyl tariffs, these 35% tariffs that apply to non-free trade goods that Canada sends to the U.S., have now been deemed illegal. Here's what they had to say.
The court has held that that IEPA does not give the president the sweeping power to just simply, make and unmake tariffs on all products for any reason.
Now, despite the fact that the court has deemed these tariffs to be illegal, they are allowing them to stay in place until October 14th. They say that will give the Trump administration an opportunity to appeal this to the Supreme Court, which they have told Global News tonight that they plan to do in this situation. That will bring them potential ultimate victory. We should point out, Eric, that the Supreme Court has a Republican majority, and there are multiple justices on there that have been appointed by Donald Trump.
Do you know, I love how right out of the gate, the anchor says, or at least heavily implies, that Canada's economic misfortunes are due almost entirely to these tariffs, which I'm not discounting that the tariffs have an impact on Canada's economy, but I would argue that the Liberal government over the past 10 years has had more of an impact.
Well, this is the thing, right? And this is where the whole indictment of Mark Carney comes into play, because he was the one saying that he was going to be the one to handle Donald Trump. He was the one that knew how to deal with Donald Trump. He's the one that was going to get a deal for Canada with Donald Trump. And here we are, not even, 5 months later after his initial appointment in March, and we have no deal. And his guys have been trying to get a deal with Donald Trump all this time. And then not even, a week or two ago, he comes out and says, oh, but there's no need for us to even negotiate anything because we already have the best deal.
Well, and the interesting thing is many other countries around the world have trade deals with the United States, and Canada is one of the few, maybe even the only one, I'm not sure, that doesn't. And we're kind of like saved by the bell in this case because it's through the United States courts that they're saying, no, these are illegal. And Carney didn't actually do anything to remove these tariffs. It was all within the United States judiciary.
Well, but just to touch on a few things, people will argue, well, you do have a deal with the U.S. It's through CUSMA. Fine, we have a deal through CUSMA, but the point is we didn't get any sort of new deal to reduce the tariffs that we already have, right? That's the main point. And as they said in the newscast, the tariffs technically are still in place. So for anyone saying, yay, this is going to provide us relief, no, it doesn't. because all of the tariffs that Donald Trump has already put in, legal or not, are still there and will be until at least October. So there's still another couple of months. But before we get any further, I wanted to bring in the U.S. media on both sides. So we got a pro-Democrat news agency to give their perspective of this, and a pro-Republican news agency to give their perspective of this. See if you can spot the difference.
A U.S. appeals court ruling today that most of the president's tariffs are illegal. Reuters says that undercuts the president's use of the levies as a key international economic policy tool here. So this is breaking right now. Now, the court allowed the tariffs to remain in place through October 14th to give the Trump administration a chance to file an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court here. So the tariffs, they're still in place, but this court ruled that they're illegal. Now we'll see whether or not the highest court in the land takes them up. So this is what we know, reading from Reuters. You know, Trump has made tariffs a pillar of foreign policy in his second term. He uses them to exert political pressure and to renegotiate trade deals with countries that export goods to us, to the U.S. Now, the tariffs have given the administration leverage to extract economic concessions from trading partners, but have also increased volatility in financial markets. So the court said this, quote, "The statute bestows significant authority on the president to undertake a number of actions in response to a declared national emergency, but none of these actions explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties, or the like, or the power to tax."
In a huge blow to the White House and its agenda, and a big win, I would say, for everyone else, a federal appeals court has just ruled that Trump's sprawling tariffs are unlawful and invalid. Of course, the president has been obsessed with imposing his willy-nilly tariffs on Americans. In fact, it has been the central plank of his entire economic agenda. Now, it has been wildly unpopular. It's polling underwater. It is costing consumers and corporations billions and billions of dollars by the day. It's stopping the Fed from cutting interest rates by driving inflation. It has, on the whole, been really bad economic policy. And most of the discussion of these tariffs have been focused on that. But there's also something about these tariffs, which is that from the jump, they've been pretty clearly illegal. I mean, think about it for a second. Can the president just by himself create tariffs that raise hundreds of billions of dollars with zero congressional input? These tariffs are a violation of the law that they purport to use as the justification, and a violation of the spirit of the Constitution of a country which was quite literally founded on the belief the executive cannot unilaterally just impose a tax without representation, specifically tariffs.
Could you tell the difference? I could tell the difference. All right, so as a result of actually researching for this story, I learned more about U.S. national emergency law that I ever felt I would have use for, but it is what it is. So we come to the point, all right, an appeals court has said the Trump tariffs are illegal, and you have until the middle of October until that actually forces them to be invalidated. So right now they're in place. That gives the Trump administration basically, month and a half to challenge that in court and to determine whether or not this is actually legal or not. Now, the Supreme Court is a majority Republican-controlled Supreme Court, so you may think on the outset that, well, that means that they're going to side with Trump. Well, not necessarily.
Well, and I found that was interesting that the Canadian newscasters were making that point, almost to say that, well, don't get your hopes up because the Supreme Court is majority Republicans, and some of them were even appointed by Trump.
Well, and it's also to stoke that fear a little bit more. But,
yes, it is.
But if I wanted to be completely objective, it may also be letting small businesses know that, don't be getting ready to go on easy street right now because these tariffs are still in place, and small businesses and large businesses have to plan months out in order to forecast what their operational costs and operational activities are going to be. So that's me being completely objective. But
there is a bit of fear mongering to it, don't you think?
There absolutely is.
To the Canadian voters.
There absolutely is. So
because why would the newscaster say that? Like, it just, I don't know. It seemed out of place to me.
Right. Now, so we decide to take a look and see what is the likelihood of this and how did this even come into place in the first place. So let's take a look at some U.S. law. So, ladies and gentlemen, this all stems from something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA, as it's affectionately known down south. So, in order to actually call some of these tariffs into place in the first place, Mr. Trump needs to declare a national emergency, but we'll take a look at that shortly. What we're going to be looking at is a summary of the IEEPA, and this is going to talk about the history and what you need to do in order to actually call it. So the IEEPA provides the president broad authority to regulate a variety of economic transactions following a declaration of national emergency. Sounds like the Emergencies Act, doesn't it? IEEPA, like the Trading with the Enemy Act, from which it is branched, sits at the center of the modern U.S. sanctions regime. Changes in the use of IEEPA powers since the Act's enactment in 1977 have caused some to question whether the statute's oversight provisions are robust enough given the sweeping economic powers it confers upon the president during a declared emergency.
Over the course of the 20th century, Congress delegated increasing amounts of emergency power to the president by statute. TWEA was one such statute. Congress passed TWEA in 1917 to regulate international transactions with enemy powers following U.S. entry into the First World War. Congress expanded the act during the 1930s to allow the president to declare a national emergency in times of peace and assume sweeping powers over both domestic and international transactions. Between 1945 and early 1970s, TWEA became the central means to impose sanctions as part of U.S. Cold War strategy. Presidents used TWEA to block international financial transactions, seize U.S.-based assets held by foreign nationals, restrict exports, modify regulations to deter the hoarding of gold, limit foreign direct investments in U.S. companies, and impose tariffs on all imports into the United States. Following committee investigations that discovered that the United States had been in a state of emergency for more than 40 years, Congress passed the National Emergencies Act, or NEA, in 1976 and IEEPA in 1977. The pair of statutes placed new limits on presidential emergency powers. Both included reporting requirements to increase transparency and track costs, and the NEA required the president to assess annually and extend, if appropriate, an emergency. However, some experts argue that the renewal process has become pro forma. The NEA also afforded Congress the means to terminate a national emergency by adopting a concurrent resolution in each chamber. A decision by the Supreme Court in a landmark case, however, found the use of concurrent resolutions to terminate an executive action unconstitutional. Congress amended the statute to require a joint resolution, significantly increasing the difficulty of terminating an emergency.
Okay, so essentially, what has to happen here is, in order for President Trump to do what he thought he was able to do, is he needed to declare a national emergency as part of the National Emergency Act, or the NEA, and then that would allow him to invoke the IEEPA to then exert the executive power of the executive branch on foreign states, aka he interprets that as he's allowed to actually use tariffs. And reading some of the summary and the history of this, you may think, well, that sounds legal. However, this is what it specifically says that he can do in the IEEPA when it comes to foreign states and their economy. So IEEPA's statute. Section A, investigate, regulate, or prohibit Subsection I, any transactions in foreign exchange, transfers of credit, or payments between, by, through, or to any banking institution to the extent that such transfers or payments involve any interest of any foreign country or national thereof. Subsection 3, the importing or exporting of currencies or securities. So the challenge here is it doesn't say tariffs. This is the challenge. Now, where the legal argument lies, and we're not going to take a position on this because A, we're not lawyers, and B, we haven't even looked at the US law. But essentially where the legal argument fault line is right here, where people that are looking at the legislation verbatim are saying, well, it doesn't include tariffs, so therefore the president is unlawfully implementing tariffs on other countries as part of the IEEPA. That's what they'll say. Now, people that are arguing for this are going to say, okay, but just because it doesn't say tariffs doesn't mean that it's not implied, because the law says any transactions. So you can potentially interpret that as part of regulating any transactions, and that is mentioned in there as well, that implies tariffs. This is where this legal fault line in argument is essentially being battered back and forth. Now, in the Supreme Court, you do have some constitutional purists on the Republican side, and what they may look at is, if they look back at the Declaration of Independence and the spirit of which it was founded and the spirit of which the U.S. Constitution was written and is upheld, they may say, listen, there is no taxation without representation. That was the whole point of the American Revolution in the first place.
That's right.
So tariffs are a tax.
It's the American people who pay it, right?
Right.
If you have business owners who are getting goods or parts or whatnot from Canada, they're paying the import tax on it, but then they have to pass that cost along to their customers. So it's bad for the American people in that regard. And it's bad for the Canadian people in the sense that maybe those businesses will stop buying Canadian goods. Maybe they buy from, I don't know, some other country overseas where it's less of a tariff to bring things over. Or maybe they buy domestic. So it affects all of us, and it's not really good for anybody, to be truthful.
Now, one question I asked is, okay, well, what's their definition of an emergency? Because when it came to Canada's definition of emergency, it was a little vague, but there was some specifics in there. I was very surprised to learn that in the National Emergencies Act in the United States, they don't define what an emergency actually is.
So it's dissimilar to the one in Canada.
Right. So I guess when they were talking about the law back in 1976, there was debate whether or not they should define it in the act, but they said, you know what, that's not important. So we'll just leave it up to the president to decide what a national emergency actually is. The trouble is if you assume that every president is going to enact a national emergency in good faith, imagine if Trudeau was president, then you're opening up the possibility of it to be abused. So is this a case where it's being abused or not? Again, we're not providing a legal opinion on that. But there's some things that people should be aware, because what this will probably be spun into is, see, it's not Mark Carney's fault. It's all Trump's fault, and yada, 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 yada.
He did this illegally in the first place. He wasn't supposed to do it, et cetera, et cetera.
And they may try to convince all Canadians that all of the Trump tariffs are as a result of this illegal action. They would be wrong. So one of the things that Donald Trump did is he increased the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Everybody understands that. That was not done under the jurisdiction of the IEEPA. Therefore, that is not actually being subject to this court scrutiny. So even if the Supreme Court says, yep, that was illegal, Trump can't do that, the steel and aluminum tariffs won't change.
Right, and that's going to devastate economies like here in Hamilton.
Right, and here's proof that it wasn't subject to the IEEPA, because here's the actual announcement on the White House website. So this is a really long announcement But you can see this is one of the presidential actions, and it says adjusting of imports of aluminum and steel into the United States. And here's the specific part you need to look at. It's actually in the first sentence. On January 11th, 2018, the Secretary of Commerce transmitted to me a report on the Secretary's investigation into the effect of imports of steel mill articles on the national security of the United States under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 as amended, etc., etc. The Secretary found and advised me of his opinion that steel articles are being imported into the United States in such quantities and under such circumstances as to threaten to impair the national security of the United States. So these tariffs were actually introduced in 2018 and changed in 2025 based on the actual National Security Act, not as a result of the IEEPA. So these are not subject to any court scrutiny whatsoever. They will be here regardless. Here's something else that'll be here. Suspending duty-free de minimis treatment for all countries. By the authority vested in me as President of the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the National Emergencies Act, Section 604 of the Trade Act of 1974, as amended, etc., etc., the United States Code, it is hereby ordered. What is it ordered? It's ordered that all of the duty fees that were waived for small businesses that were handling shipments valued at under $800 over the border, that's all terminated. So as a small business, if you were sending goods back and forth across the border and the value of those was under $800, you didn't have to pay any duty fees whatsoever. So it was geared towards small businesses. That has ended. So this is one of the big problems for small businesses in Canada that are doing small transactions across the border when it comes to goods and services. And this is going to hit them because small businesses do not have a large budget and they get hit very hard from things like this.
Well, and my mom used to have a small business, and she was in Niagara Falls, a border city, where if she had U.S. customers, she would bring the goods to the United States. She'd have to fill out paperwork and whatnot, but she wasn't paying duties to have it shipped to an American customer, not to my knowledge. Anyways, so today, if she still had that business and was still doing the same thing, she would have to mark up those items to cover the duty now, which maybe customers don't want to buy something that has a duty on it.
Well, and that's exactly what happened, because shortly after this was announced, there was a lot of canceled orders as a result of this, and that's a lot of lost revenue for these businesses. So that's a big problem, and it just goes to show that this is not going to go away, and we can't just sit here and wait for someone else to save us, because the Supreme Court of Canada is not going to save all these small businesses, and Mark Carney is obviously not going to save all these small businesses. So, this is going to be a big problem, and this is not subject to this court ruling because this isn't a tariff. This is just it's a pre-existing fee, and all Donald Trump did was he removed the exemption.
Yeah, it's not a tariff, it's a duty.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's much more easily argued that, of course he had the legal right to do this because this isn't a tariff. And that's actually not what's being argued in court. What's being argued in court is he doesn't have the authority to implement these tariffs all by himself. So this actually isn't up for debate either. What does this mean? Well, unfortunately, it's more bad news for Canadian small businesses. This actually came out about a week ago, and it was an article in the CTV where it says a roller coaster of announcements. The CFIB warns about 40% of small businesses will close within a year.
Canadian small businesses are feeling the pressure of the Canada-US trade war as a national advocacy group warns about 40% will close up shop for good within a year. Tariffs on steel and aluminum and retaliatory duties on U.S. goods are hurting small business owners, with a quarter fearing they will go under in 6 months if there aren't any changes to tariff rates, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, or CFIB.
This is not good news.
No.
For small businesses. And where's Mark Carney? On vacation.
Right. He could have chosen to keep Parliament running throughout the summer. And we heard Pierre in one of his final speeches in Oakville say that he was willing to have his MPs work all summer. And Mark Carney said, no, you know what, we're going to take the summer off. We're not going to legislate during the summer. This is such a pressing crisis that we're going to go and do the barbecue circuit instead.
Well, and just to prove the point, this is not due to lack of labor, folks, because StatsCan actually released one of the latest job metrics for this year, and it isn't pretty. Employment rate falls in July following an increase in June. So you can see how this graph is trending and has been trending since the middle of 2022. And it's not pretty, folks. And we actually looked at the net increase in jobs for 2025, and it's not a net increase.
No, it's pretty much the same since January. So there were some gains in June and they were lost in July.
And as far as the gains elsewhere in the year, there have been so many net losses month by month that since this year, we've effectively gained 0 jobs in the economy.
Well, and I think the most important thing to point out in the July jobs report, which was released on August the 8th, it shows that most of the jobs lost were full-time positions.
And here's another reason as to why that's the case. Just announced the other day, Crown Royal Bottler closing down Ontario plant, shifting some operations to the United States.
Now, we posted something similar to our X profile and received a lot of, well, you know, it's a small bottling plant, it's not that many jobs, etc., etc. Even if it's 100 jobs, that's 100 families who don't know where their next meal is coming from. It's 100 families who might not be able to pay their rent, clothe their children. Like, this is an impact. These are our neighbors. These are our friends.
Well, and this is just one business that is making headlines. Look at these small businesses. There are thousands and thousands of small businesses across the country. And if 40% of them are not going to be able to last the year, like small businesses, typically they employ maybe, up to 50 people. Some of them employ one person, but their employment nonetheless. And in all of these people, that's thousands of people that may lose their jobs across the country.
Right. Small businesses are the lifeblood of our economy. I'd say at least half of my family members, us included, own a small business. And maybe they don't employ a lot of people. One of my family members employs probably about 50 people, but these are still jobs. These are still careers for people. These are still a means of income, a roof over your head, food in your belly, and Canada is bleeding jobs.
So it's expected. Donald Trump even expects it. Here's his post. So we're not going to read all of it, but you can see that he firmly expects that this is going to survive the Supreme Court and the tariffs are still going to be in effect, and his actions will be deemed legal. But he seems to think that they're going to be around, and this means that Canada is not going to be out of the woods. And even if they were deemed illegal, do you think Trump is going to stop there? He's going to figure out some way to do what he wants. And the problem is we would not be in this position if it weren't for 10 years of bad liberal policy. We wouldn't be here. We would be in a much, much stronger position and more self-sufficient economically, and in a position to say, all right, the US does this, fine. We're going to double the capacity of our already existing east-west pipelines and resource carriers to get our raw materials out of our country and out to the European and Asian markets. But we don't have that option. So this is the issue. And Mark Carney, rather than trying to get something done, rather than move with this urgency that he said that he was going to move with, he sat in Parliament for a couple of months, and this was after Justin Trudeau prorogued Parliament for another 2 months, and he decided to take the entire Parliament on vacation. So you got to ask, where was this crisis? Where was this most significant crisis in our lifetimes? Well, if I believe Mark Carney, and if you all want to believe Mark Carney, then Mark Carney's response to the most significant crisis in our lifetimes is to actually go on vacation. Is that the leader you want?